welcome from my side, and after the intense day we had already yesterday, so I'm happy to chair this next session. And let's begin. Our first speaker is Rok Benčin, and he is a research associate at the Institute of Philosophy, Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Art here. He teaches at the postgraduate school here at the Center and the Academy of Fine Arts and Design at the University of Ljubljana. He has held seminars at the University of Paris 8 and the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. His research explores the intersections of aesthetics, ontology, and politics in contemporary philosophy. And his book, Rethinking the Concept of World Towards Transcendental Multiplicity, was published this year by Edinburgh University Press. So please help welcome me, Rok Benčin.
Thank you, Helmut. My paper is titled Art and the Frontiers of Aesthetic Experience. 20 years ago, Jacques Rancière published Malaise dans l'esthétique, Aesthetics and its Discontents in the English translation, in which he argues against critiques of aesthetics that either condemn it for producing sensory illusions that obscure their own social context, or for creating philosophical illusions that confuse the understanding of artworks and sensory experience with speculations on the absolute. Needless to say, Rancière's rehabilitation of aesthetics goes hand in hand with the defense of the aesthetic regime of art, his reconceptualization of artistic modernity. Yet, there is one argument against aesthetics that Rancière seems less interested in grappling with, namely the argument that the inadequacy of aesthetics to provide a useful understanding of contemporary art does not stem from an excess of philosophical speculation, but from its inability of speculating beyond the limits of sensible experience. While the notion of the aesthetic regime of art focuses on the way art expands the frontiers of aesthetic experience, contemporary art, it is claimed, has moved beyond its limits decades ago. The argument does not only pertain to the epistemological questions of thinking and understanding art, but also, to a stronger degree, to its very ontology. Peter Osborne, whom I specifically have in mind here, claims that contemporary art, which he defines as post-conceptual art, has established a new artistic ontology beyond the aesthetic. The historical transformation of the ontology of the artwork, he claimed in 2013's Anywhere or Not at All, is yet to be grasped by the European philosophical tradition, even in recent Rancièrean or Deleuzean guises, which makes their application to art-critical discourses on contemporary art seriously deficient. My intention in this paper is not to argue for or against this argument, and particularly not on the basis of any kind of a survey of modern or contemporary art in which its aesthetic status may or may not be determined. My intention, rather, is to explore the notion of the sensible at play in aesthetic experience as part of the aesthetic regime of art, or perhaps aesthetic theory more generally, to explore it, that is, from the perspective of its frontiers. The frontiers of aesthetic experience in the title of my paper attempt to mark this dilemma between, on the one hand, the frontiers as something to be expanded, and on the other, as something to be crossed, venturing into the beyond. Conveniently, in Le Voyage de l'Art, his latest book on art, Rancière provides the following characterization of the aesthetic regime. I quote, the existence of art as a particular sphere of experience has as its correlate the indetermination of its frontiers. End of quote. Within the aesthetic regime, therefore, the ontological ground of art equals a particular sphere of experience, but this particularity is characterized by the indetermination of frontiers rather than a clear delimitation. Rancière never hesitates to define this specific sphere of experience as aesthetic. Art is an affair of sensible experience, and sensible experience is the object of aesthetics. There are, however, three initial complications that prevent immediate identification between the artistic sphere of experience and the aesthetic field of sensible experience as such. First, as we have already seen, the artistic sphere of experience is defined by the indetermination of its frontiers. Its definition is thus not a delimitation that would allow us to immediately align its borders with any predetermined field. It requires a more dialectical approach. Second, the field of sensible experience is, as is self-evident, broader than the sphere of art, regardless of the regime that defines it. Furthermore, and this is not self-evident, but a proposition specific to Rancière's thought, art is not the only praxis that relies on the field of sensible experience for its ontological grounding. The other is politics. And this brings us to the third complication. The field of sensible experience has no positive definition in Rancière. A positive definition of the aesthetic seems to be the center of what bothers Osborne, as he claims, I quote, "The aesthetic concept of art mistakes one of art's many conditions for the whole. It mistakes art's necessary aesthetic appearance for the ground of its apparently autonomous and hence infinite production of meaning, which is in fact historically relational rather than positive in an aesthetic sense," end of quote. So is there any positive aesthetic sense in Rancière? The aesthetic element in art is not identical to the beautiful or sensible pleasure. It is hardly even a form of judgment. Even when the expansion of sensible experience is at play, it is not the intensity of a sublime experience or a transgression of pushing the boundaries to the extreme that is at stake. It is something much more subtle, although perhaps more radical, a redistribution of the sensible. But even if we consider it positive in the simple sense of sensible perception, the field of sensible experience in itself, we find that it is in fact not positive at all, but historically relational. This is precisely the point of Rancière's central concept, the distribution of the sensible. There is a negative aspect to the sensible, in the sense that it is always split and never experienced immediately in its positive fullness. Additionally, the split is relational, social, and historical. It depends on the historically determined distributions of capacities, temporal and spatial forms that link sensible singularities, forms of intelligibility that make sense of them, and the resulting demarcations between the perceptible and the imperceptible. So let's start again from the beginning and take a look at the dialectics that underpins Rancière's understanding of the aesthetic regime. What is the meaning of the proposition that the frontiers of the sphere of art are indeterminate? As he says in Aesthetics and its Discontents, the aesthetic regime establishes the sphere of art that unifies all the arts, but at the cost of a paradoxical definition, or a lack thereof, of art. It establishes the form of perception that allows for the recognition of certain objects and practices as artworks. Yet, I quote, art is henceforth recognizable by its lack of any distinguishing characteristics, by its indistinction. There is thus first a negative movement of the aesthetic revolution in artistic practices that Rancière locates at the end of the 18th and the start of 19th centuries. The negative element of this revolution is to discard the criteria of determination, inclusion, and evaluation that has ruled over the sphere of arts up to that moment, according to Rancière. The so-called representational regime of the arts that preceded the aesthetic regime defined the arts as various ways of doing or making of artistic objects, be it paintings, sculptures, pieces of music, etc. Each of these ways of making had their own criteria that characterized the artworks as, say, a painting, and its qualities in relation to their execution related either to internal formal principles of this kind of art or external principles of the distinction related to the artwork's social functions, genre, or depicted subject. The invention of the singular term art did not only unify all these practices and criteria under a generic term, it also introduced a certain confusion when it comes to delimiting what and how can something be made and perceived as art. Under these conditions, the boundaries of various arts are destined to blur, evoking the conservative question, is this still painting or music? And finally, is this still art, etc. But even in progressive terms, it goes against the grain of a specific type of modernism that hails the formal investigation of specific media, which, from the aesthetic perspective of the blurring frontiers, is essentially reactionary, according to Rancière. Greenberg, of course, was also a foe for the conceptual artist theorist, on which Osborne bases his account of the post-conceptual condition, another sign that we might not be dealing with the same notion of the aesthetic that a certain kind of conceptual art was opposing. But still, remembering Adorno's tackling of these same issues, it is worth noting that for him as well, in Art and the Arts, a well-known text from 1967, the erosion of the lines of demarcation between the arts, and here I quote Adorno, is almost always accompanied by the attempt by works of art to reach out towards an extra-aesthetic reality. So the question persists. Returning to the aesthetic regime, we come to the positive element of its revolution, which involves a shift in defining all things artistic from the representational ways of doing to the aesthetic mode of sensible being, specific to the products of art. Artworks are thus no longer essentially defined by how or of what they are made of, what they depict, etc. They are defined by their belonging to a certain mode of being that corresponds to a specific mode of perception. So this mode of being or mode of perception is not simply sensible, but a mode of sensible experience. And this is precisely what the sphere of experience established by the aesthetic revolution makes possible, a split within the sensible itself. The positive outcome of the aesthetic revolution is a sensorium of exception, Rancière claims, a particular sensorium foreign to the ordinary forms of sensory experience. A sensorium of free appearances, disentangled from knowledge, representation, or interest, perceived through the attitude of aesthetic indifference. So it is this split within the sensible that renders its frontiers problematic. On the one hand, art is defined by the autonomy of free appearance, its suspension of ordinary experience, and thus its separation from the world, or constituting its own world at a distance. On the other hand, as Rancière claims in Aesthesis, the main book on the aesthetic regime, I quote, art exists as a separate world, since anything whatsoever can belong to it. So the establishment of art as a separate sphere of experience is based on the permeability of its frontiers. From here comes the title of Rancière's latest book. The voyages of art are the voyages that constantly traverse the frontier without suppressing it, as he claims. Making separation the condition of both the boundless influx of whatever comes within the sphere of art and the radical outflux, so to speak, of rupturing the ordinary and the remaking of the sensible world. What defines art as a specific mode of experience also makes it impossible to demarcate this specificity. Art's closure within itself is also a form of radical openness, its autonomization being a form of heteronomization. Here we find Rancière at his most dialectical or speculative. I quote, "In short, the specificity of art, finally nameable as such, is its identity with non-art." End of quote. So what exactly does this identity between art and non-art entail? First of all, what Hegel already noticed as the infinite expansion of possible material of art, making anything that is not supposed to be art susceptible to be drawn into its sphere. But what for Hegel, at least according to the general line of his aesthetics, is the dissolution of the aesthetic ideal in the romantic form of art, is for Rancière the emergence of a new artistic regime. The identity of art and non-art also implies the identity of the ordinary and the exceptional. From Hegel's fascination with the way genre painting portrayed metal luster or old chaps in dirty jackets, to Stendhal's autobiographic report on the significance of a sound coming from a water pump, the significance this sound had for his early aesthetic education, the aesthetic regime can make of anything an exceptional sensory event. It is not just that anything can enter into the sphere of art. The sphere of art seems to radiate outwards, making possible to perceive anything as potentially exceptional, as though through an artistic formalization. So in a sense, this aesthetic split within the sensible is even transferable to the outside world, outside of art. Blurring boundaries also affect the demarcation between fine and applied arts, specifically so after the latter detached from ornamentation to focus on function rather than any kind of aesthetics. Yet it is precisely in this movement, that Rancière sees aesthetics par excellence. The idea that it is possible to change the mode of human living to create a new society by way of designing industrial objects for everyday use. Finally, the denegation of aesthetic difference within art itself. This is another consequence of the identity between art and non-art. So the self-suppression of art's own exceptionality in order to intervene directly in societies as critical historical moments, as in the avant-gardes. That is what I have in mind. So this again is seen by Rancière as aesthetic, since it seeks to create a new form of life, a new experience of the world at the expense of the old, and of course also at the expense of aesthetic or artistic exceptionality. This is only possible if the sensible is a common ground of both aesthetics and politics. For Rancière, politics is the capacity to construct a common world out of the sensible tissue of experience, consisting of things, words, gestures, perceptions, etc. More precisely, it is not simply an exercise of such capacity, but the conflict over its bare existence and the distribution which comes down to the conflict over the very forms used to turn a sensible multiplicity into a common world. Common to both art and politics, without being reducible to each other, is the power to split the sensible, to split the world in two. The border between the two registers within which they can do this remains in place, but the aesthetic element of politics and the political element of aesthetics, which Rancière develops on the basis of Schiller's connection between Kant's Third Critique and the French Revolution, remains irreducible to each other. The aesthetic element of politics and the political element of aesthetics remain irreducible to each other, but also make cross-border exchange a necessity for both. So the identity between art and non-art also entails that the split which the aesthetic revolution makes within the sensible is what disenables any positive delimitation of the sensible as such, as opposed to the intelligible or the material. As Rancière claims, this is a quote, these products of art are characterized by their belonging to the mode of being of a sensible element that differs from itself, identical with the form of thought that also differs from itself. And as he adds in numerous places, it is also, in a sense, a form of materiality that differs from itself. In the first scene of the aesthetic regime described in Aesthesis, Rancière's discussion of Winkelmann's admiration of the Belvedere torso, so in this discussion, these three dimensions coincide. As a fragment, the mutilated statue can no longer be thought of in representational terms of proportion, adequacy, expressivity. The muscles of the hero bent his back in the pose of a thinker, and it is this pensive idleness that, and in its pensive idleness, the curves of the muscles resemble those of the waves. And this is how Rancière describes this on the basis of Winkelmann. I quote, "The apex of art is the mutilated statue that represents the greatest active hero miscast in the total inactivity of pure thought." So we have action, thought. Moreover, this pure thought only stands out as its exact opposite, the radical impersonality of a material movement very similar to immobility, the perpetual oscillations of waves on a calm sea. So we have the sensible materiality, thought and the material movement and non-movement, all kind of in this identity of opposites. So the coincidence of the sensible thought and matter, described here in a very specific context, can be generalized in two very different ways that Rancière occasionally takes. On the one hand, it is possible to make the connection between the aesthetic revolution and the great inventions of materialistic thought, as Rancière does in his book on the aesthetic element of Freudian unconscious, or his occasional remarks on Marx's account of commodity fetishism, as both being enabled by the aesthetic discovery of the split within the sensible. So thought in the sensible, sensible in thought, the presence of another sensible within the sensible, etc. But there is also another generalizing path, the path closer to vitalism, in fact, which Rancière sometimes describes as the fictional metaphysics of the aesthetic regime. The multiplicity of sensible singularities constitutes the quasi-ontological ground upon which the aesthetic forms operate, but to which all of its creations can ultimately also be dissolved. Here, Rancière indeed comes close to grounding art in a positive field of sensible experience, although positive in a Deleuzian sense of becomings and singularities, a reference he often makes himself, despite elsewhere criticizing Deleuze's ontologization of art. So in the Deleuzian sense of becomings and singularities, rather than any stable and distinct sense of the sensible as distinguished from the intelligible, the spiritual, or the material. So back to the initial question, what is the sensible from the perspective of its frontiers? On the one hand, the sensible seems boundless, since it converges with an infinite multiplicity of sensible singularities as the ontological ground of human experience as such, and why not also animal experience, as Uexküll shows in relation to animal transcendental aesthetics, which Deleuze later puts in relation to art. On the other, it is permitted with internal splits that at the same time establish and eradicate its relative boundaries. The forms and capacities of sensible experience are distributed historically and socially, diachronically and simultaneously. They are inherently unstable and dissensual. In Kantian terms, the aesthetics that can deal with such an object is less a matter of judgment than a matter of the transcendental. It is a matter of forms of perception and understanding that arrange and make sense of the sensible multiplicity that surrounds us. However, such transcendental forms do not set the parameters of possible experience once and for all. They are historical and multiple. The sensible is not only correlational, it is hyper-correlational. The limits of possible experience these forms dictate are unstable, and it is this instability that makes both politics and art possible. Art within the aesthetic regime is not merely an art of expanding the frontiers of sensible experience, nor simply an art that displays the redistribution of the sensible. It is rather the art powered by the instability of the frontiers of sensible experience. It is this instability that is its very object. It is the art of the split in the sensible. But what is the nature of this split? And does it relate to a certain reality or the real that might be considered as that which falls outside of sensible experience, either internally or externally? If the frontiers of sensible experience are formulated in this way, is an outside even thinkable? Or, as seems more likely following Rancière, is the split only the split between the emerging micro-transcendentals, each artwork perhaps establishing its own? And there is no outside apart from the gap between these singular transcendentals. Or at least the proper outside is left out in a properly Kantian way. So thinking of these questions, it might be useful to compare Rancière to Adorno, with whom he shares the reaffirmation of artistic autonomy on the condition of unconditional identity of autonomy and heteronomy. For Adorno, art, precisely as autonomous, exists only in relation to its other. It is the process that transpires with its other. The relation of art to its other is not exactly the same thing as the identity between art and non-art, where non-art, if it remains within the field of the sensible, might not be other at all. What Adorno's aesthetics allows us to think, albeit on a highly speculative level, is art not only in its So what Adorno's aesthetics allows us to think is art not only in its mode of production, and the suspension of ordinary experience it enables, but artistic production in relation to the general capitalist mode of production. For Adorno, the truth to be found in art is the truth of its illusory separation from the material world as appearance and from other commodities as a useless but autonomous object. This separation has truth content since it harbors the utopia of another kind of production and objectivity. At the same time, it is illusory, since art is but a commodity. In fact, commodity fetishism is the condition of the idea of autonomy of art in the first place. Even if the autonomy of art can help understand commodity fetishism as Rancière proposes. So in any case, in Adorno, art is the perfect achievement of fetishism, fully deprived of use value, even the usefulness of exchange value, at least in its illusory status. Art is therefore in constant relation to its other, but precisely because it is the same, just a commodity. And if there is a truth value in art, it is in this very sameness. Art expresses the fetishism of any other commodity more than any other commodity. In her critique of Rancière's notion of the aesthetic regime, Antonia Birnbaum claims that in Adorno, one can find, at least in principle, the place for thinking the relation of art to non-art, not merely as an abstract idea, but in its locality and historicity as the capitalist mode of production and its transformations. This, she claims, is left out of the notion of the aesthetic regime. But the problem for her is not only that the aesthetic regime loses sight of its other. The problem is also that the aesthetic regime does not allow for any kind of internal problem. Once it sets its meta-narrative, it seems capable of indefinitely expanding its continuity, linking any novelty to the same matrix developed more than 200 years ago as the aesthetic echo of the French Revolution. The problem, therefore, is that there is no possible problem that the notion of the aesthetic regime could encounter. Following this line of argument, one could conclude that Rancière's aesthetics is not dialectical enough, since it revolves around instabilities caused by the identity of opposites rather than following a development of a series of contradictions. Although I feel obliged to observe, the development of a series of contradictions is actually what Rancière does much more noticeably on a methodological level in his earlier works, before his notion of the aesthetic regime, his earlier works on literature, especially in La chair des mots and La parole muette. However, returning one last time to Adorno, the dialectics of art and its other may problematize its sensible element, but clings onto it just the same. For Adorno, the artistic emancipation of appearance from empirical reality becomes a scandal, this is a quote, becomes a scandal in the face of the overwhelming power of economic and political reality. So, according to Adorno, art attempts to renounce its autonomous appearance, which has become so problematic, but it can only do so art attempts to renounce its autonomous appearance, which has become so problematic, by identifying with reality instead of reflecting it. And this is another quote from Art and the Arts. The more an art allows the more an art allows material that is not contained in its own continuum to enter it, the more it participates in alien thing-like matter instead of imitating it. So here we see Adorno claiming that aesthetic appearance kind of slips away, and when artworks become just like any other matter. Yet, as problematic as it may become, the separation of aesthetic appearance is, nevertheless, for Adorno, irreversible and inescapable, and can only be renounced by renouncing art altogether. For Adorno, art can ultimately only stay true to its identity with its other by pursuing its identity with itself, by internalizing this non-relation and exploring it within its proper forms. So in contrast to this, for Rancière, art is the process of exiting. This is the voyage of art. anything can enter into the artistic sphere of experience, but only to allow art to never stop leaving itself, and this is a quote, only to allow art to never stop leaving itself, not only to exist, to exit its proper places to explore the world that surrounds it, but to question its own identity and perfection and become something more or something other than itself. End of quote. So the sensible may not have an outside, but the only reason it has a frontier is to be able to depart from itself. For Adorno, the artistic fight against appearance leaves a residue of appearance, or in other words, it can only fight appearance within the sphere of appearance. Osborne also admits as much. Post-conceptual art still requires an aesthetic dimension, even though it is no longer essential and is even essentially anti-aestheticist. In contrast to this, Rancière's conception of the aesthetics is indeed more positive, but not in the sense of clinging to some positive appreciation of the sensible as an essential element of art. If anything, the aesthetic regime is the regime of the remainder of the sensible, which remains essential precisely as the remainder of a radical de-aesthetization. In a sense, it allows us to think aesthetic appearance as the negativity of the sensible, its split that throws it outside of itself, but positive in the sense of what this split allows us to do, perceive, and think. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, Rok, for this very dense paper. Are there any immediate questions? Yeah, Alexei?
Maybe, is it working? Yeah. Okay, maybe just, I mean, I was kind of curious where you stand with this problem that you posed and left undecided, you know, in the presentation, namely, is Rancière grounding art within a sort of reconceptualization of the sensible, such that then art is in some sense, let's say, paradigmatic or an intensification of a kind of transformation of how thought relates to its sensible condition, or how thought or the sensible as such is thus invested with a new mode of thinking, you know, about itself, which you kind of get in like the aesthetic unconscious, where in a book like that, it seems as if Rancière is sort of, you know, thinking the aesthetic regime as a kind of epoch within which one can inscribe the emergence of psychoanalysis, the emergence of art, and also the emergence of radical politics. So then you kind of have this Foucauldian notion that we're dealing with a kind of epochal break, which then art would be paradigmatic of. Yeah. Or is it so much that, you know, art produces a new form of experience, which then almost analogically, we can then sort of map onto, you know, relations of sensible experience, which would separate, you know, separate the sensible from itself, such that we can then see it as a kind of art-like experience. I mean, at the end, I mean, I didn't. You kind of left that open, I guess. Maybe.
Yeah, I think both of these directions, both of these options are necessarily have to be thought of simultaneously. I think they're both true in a sense. So yes, it is for Rancière like a Foucauldian epochal shift, and the sensible is kind of the lure of this shift in the sense, but in the sense that the sensible is not thought of as something that would be separate from thought or from materiality, but it is this sensible that is essentially split and is sort of identical with a certain ontological multiplicity as such. So, and I think that art is paradigmatic of this shift, but within art itself, it establishes art as something that is, at least in an illusory manner, separated from the outside world. But this is this separation is is one of the modes of how this epochal shift operates. It is not something that would, I mean, it allows art to make this, to kind of make the split in the sensible its object, but without really separating art as a really separate form of experience, right? So this is, I think, the dialectical moment in Rancière. So that this separation is a means of art to tackle this epochal shift that it is paradigmatic of, but that this epochal shift is not, of course, identical or limited to art. Yeah. So I think both of these have to be thought simultaneously and together necessarily. Yeah.
Jan?
Well, thank you. So I have two short questions or remarks, and one is more skeptical, and the other is, I guess, more I hope, in the direction of your argument. So first, I start with the skeptical, because I was thinking, like, or it reminded me of a problem which came to my mind, which I often have in reading Rancière in terms of politics, and that is the question of organization. And while listening to your going through the question of the aesthetic regime and the transformation and the instability of limits, I was wondering whether one could also ask whether Rancière perhaps has a similar problem in aesthetics, namely to give a conceptual understanding of the organization of the sensible in forms of its material appearance, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So that would be the question of the œuvre, so to speak. Is there any concept of the œuvre as such in the strong sense? I mean, of course,
you mean in a Badiousian sense, or like in his...
well, I mean, let's say, but you would have an understanding of the œuvre, but no, and I mean, you perhaps need also. I mean, I take it from the question of politics. Now, you could say, well, at a certain point, you need to pin it down to some structure and say, here it is, and here it ends. And this is what we're talking about. And I was wondering whether this not perhaps is a problem which also appears on the question of the aesthetic. I don't know. I mean, that's just a thought or a skeptical comment. Maybe let me put the second. The second is very short as well, because I was wondering, I mean, and that might be more, I thought, an argument in your direction, because is there actually any existing moment of the aesthetic regime in a pure sense? Because I had the impression that Rancière is actually always describing only sorts of specific states or specific appearances of forms which are already derivatives of the aesthetic regime of art. They're never truly it. They're always already a bit like too much this, too much that. And so this might be also perhaps an argument in your sense, because there is no purity of the aesthetic regime as such. No, it's only its existing forms are impure. No? Yeah.
Oh, thanks. I think maybe there's one answer to both of your questions. Well, I think, the aesthetic regime in the way that Rancière conceives of it is essentially unpure. I mean, it is in a sense, a heap of contradictions that is kind of tied with this, only negatively tied together. And so it is, it only exists in impure forms in which one or the other of these several distinctions and poles comes into the fore and maybe takes over at the expense of some other dimension of it. And only if you take this various scenes and works and discourses or whatever as a sort of unstable whole, you can describe the aesthetic regime. But if you take any a specific scene of it, it has its own specificities in the way it, in a singular way or a particular way, kind of provides a sort of stabilization of these essential instabilities or identities of opposites or whatever within a particular oeuvre or thought or discourse or whatever. So I think there is no paradigmatic pure, okay, this is a static regime, because, yeah, it can only exist through singular scenes, and which brings us back to politics, which is, I mean, Rancière would say the same for politics, I guess. And, but the problem of the organization, to come to that, I think that even if you take, I mean, if you read Rancière's readings of artworks or discourses on artworks in all these particular scenes that he analyzes, I think you do have, I mean, it's not just, I don't think that he always just describes how a particular, I don't know, work of art destabilizes some relations or whatever. I think he does have some good analysis that claim, okay, in this work, it is like this and like this. This is how this work organizes the sensible. I think this is present in Rancière's analysis of art. So I don't think he has a problem with that. But of course, in a political sense, it's, I mean, with art, it's not a problem that, you know, I think Adorno says somewhere that every art is the enemy of any other art, that any artwork is the enemy of all other artworks, which, I mean, translated to Rancière's notion, I mean, Rancière would never say that because the notion, I mean, of artworks being enemies to each other, I don't think it makes sense to Rancière, but what it makes sense to Rancière is that, what I try to say here is that basically any artwork introduces its own micro-transcendental. That's what I meant, was that it organizes the sensible multiplicity in its own way. So in the sense, every artwork can be its own thing. But with politics, it doesn't really work that way. And this is, I mean, there, of course, this is the standard anti-Rancièrean comment, of course, and I agree that there is some problem there, but yeah, I wouldn't want to go into that discussion because I don't really have a very good answer to that.
Yeah, there are two. There's one behind Usas. Yeah.
Thank you, Rok. I just wanted to ask you something. When you talked about the split in the sensible itself, and also when you talked about the conflict of existence, and considering that you're talking about borders and limits, I was wondering that you didn't mention the notion of dissensus in any way, and I was just curious whether it has no relationship in this sense or ever, or is it something that I'm just misunderstanding? It takes only in politics that dissensus comes up, not in artwork or in his theory of the aesthetic regime.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Well, of course, I would think that, yeah, I mean, of course, the dissensus in Rancière's politics has an aesthetic element, that's for sure, and of course, the art also has its own politics. So in that sense, there is a dissensus also in art, but of course, it doesn't. So the politics of aesthetics and aesthetics of politics both exist, but they are irreducible to each other. You cannot just say that, you know, it's the same thing. So it operates on the same kind of ground, but it cannot simply be switched, or you can do politics with art, simply put. So there is a sense, but there is a more general question that I am. And I think Antonia Birnbaum also writes about this in the text I quoted. So what happens when, I mean, that it's easier for Rancière to articulate his thoughts on art in a dissensual way when it is tied to a particular, at least indirectly to some form of political dissensus, but then what happens when there is no actual dissensus? Like the same question that you can ask of Badiou, but what happens when there are no events, etc. So, yeah, that's one question you could also. That's how you could reformulate your question.
Yeah.
I was just reacting to what you just said when you mentioned that any artwork introduces its own micro-transcendental. Would you, that's just like brings to my mind immediately. Like, would you be able to compare, and this is again about this question of the organization of the artwork. I was thinking about, in Logics of Worlds, Badiou's explanation of the artworks. I mean, he has this very specific canon of artistic examples that he uses in the book, like, for instance, this painting by Hubert Robert, where he talks about the artwork as the world defined by its transcendental. I mean, if you were to kind of project speculatively a little bit and compare like those two notions in terms of the organization of the artwork, I mean, I know that obviously the vocabulary is quite different, but if you were to develop on like comparing this kind of how is this experience of the sensible organized within the artwork in terms of its micro-transcendental?
Yeah. That's thanks. Actually, this is something that I the book that's my book that Helmut mentioned in presenting me deals exactly with this. So I am guilty here in this paper of, I mean, it is a paper on Rancière, but I did introduce some a conceptual apparatus that is not entirely Rancierian. So I'm guilty of that, and my use of the notion of the transcendental here is to large extent comes from Logique du Monde. So you're right about that. I think that when it comes to Rancière, he does always talk about this sensory multiplicity almost as an ontological ground, even though, of course, Rancière would never say it's ontology because he doesn't care about ontology. I mean, he always talks about how the forms of thought and forms of this and that kind of arrange the sensory multiplicity within a work of art or within a political situation or whatever. My speculative intrusion into the work of Rancière here was to just call this the transcendental, basically more in a Badiousian than in a strictly Kantian sense. Yeah, so I did apply a bit of that here. And when it comes to Badiou, I would say that, I mean, this is what I write in my book, that there is a fictional element to the way Badiou talks about the transcendental in Logique du Monde, so that there is a certain, almost a repressed fictional element of how Badiou understands worlds, and not just mathematical, but also fictional in a way, in the sense of, even when you look at his examples, when he says, I don't know, I'm sitting here in my weekend house, and there is, ivy on the wall, and then a motorcycle comes by and I'm disturbed, this is like you would read a novel or something, so
Okay, then I think I would also have one question, and that is, I think you laid it out so nicely with different, also, in almost contradictions, but, I just wanted to address a little bit, because what are my problems I have in reading Rancière with this term, for example, the aesthetic regime, so, because it's a little bit, isn't it, a regime of art, in a certain way? How is this aesthetic? Because, that is the big difference, obviously, between what is aesthetic from Baumgarten to Kant and what is art afterwards. And he's clearly speaking about art in that sense, but then also the term regime in that, is that a law, or what kind of order, or is that in here? And is it an order of expansion? Is this the logic where that art represents something? This has this expansive nature of what? Is this capitalism, or what is that? And I'm more interested in this kind of, and this whole art and politics relationship. It's also very interesting in a way, and I think you described that inner dialectics you described very nicely, but it's always a little bit disturbing how, what kind of relationship again that is, what is happening in between art and politics, and I think it's not enough saying there is something of aesthetics in politics and something. There's also this, there's this radical split also,
Yeah,
obviously, and we all know that, the aestheticization of politics and so on and so forth can be very problematic. And Rancière's investment in that, in criticizing, this kind of art activist strategies, I also feel very sympathetic to, but it doesn't answer the question in a way.
Yeah, I think your question takes us back to Alexis' question, this relation between, on the one hand, the regime of art, and on the other hand, that's the notion of the sensible in Rancière, which is almost a kind of ontology for him, and it's not only an artistic matter, but also a political matter. So we have this, so this was, my intention in this paper was just to ask myself this simple question: what does the sensible mean in Rancière? Because of course he doesn't write a philosophical book on what is the sensible, but so you have to kind of analyze it, and this is kind of, in a sense, art is paradigmatic of what happens with the sensible, but on the other hand, the sensible is some quasi-ontology that introduces a new sort of historical epoch in a Foucauldian sense, a regime, but so it's so that's what I tried to do here, to follow this notion of the sensible even beyond art, but then to think about what does art then do here in the midst of this expanded field of the sensible, filled with splits, distributions, etc., etc.
So you would say Rancière and Osborne are very close in their attempts to ontologize either the sensible or the conceptual?
I would say that what Osborne claims, that when Osborne criticizes Rancière, that aesthetics is irrelevant to conceptual art. I just think that he doesn't. I think that the notion of the sensible is much more complicated than what he has in mind when he dismisses this. So that was the starting point. Okay. Yeah. But if of course there are differences between, so I guess it's closer to than what Osborne, I guess, would think. Yeah. But of course it still remains quite different. Yeah. But that would be another paper, I think.
Okay. So many thanks, Rok.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.